If there's nothing else I'm going to say tonight that's going to be helpful, if we understand the opposite sex better, we'll move different. In the global dating market, we ain't worried about America. In the global dating market, in terms of desirability, it's white men at the top, it's black men number 2, it's Hispanic men number 3, and Asian men number 4. In terms of desirability, in terms of all the data and stats that they're collecting, in terms of marriages, in terms of sex, access to sex, and the dating app data, black men are second. Asian men are last. Asian women don't want Asian men in mass. On the flip side, depending on the depending on the data, number 1 is either Asian women or white women, depending on the study. And then number 3 is Hispanic women. And then last is black women.
You just crucified yourself.
It's not crucified, and I'll tell you why. Who else are you going to listen to in terms of whatever it is that's causing you to be at the bottom of the totem pole of desirability than a black man looking you in your face and saying, this is what I need to feel loved. This is what I need to feel connected. This is what we need in order to feel like we can get back together with y'all. And vice versa. Black women need to communicate and let us know what it is that we're failing and dropping the ball on. So all I'm saying is rather than trying to focus on men need to adapt to me, that's not the real world. If you want the job, if you want the position, you need to fill the prerequisites. If the prerequisites are softness, feminine, non-argumentative, more agreeable, either you want to be that or not. And if you were like, well, I don't want to do all of that stuff to get with a man, you're going to end up with the man that most women don't want and other men don't respect.
I'm Chris Grandison. Welcome to Xenogenesis, where I use evolutionary psychology to discuss Black community issues. And in this video, I'm going to discuss that question you just saw posed by Jeff St. James of the Ask a Brother podcast on that panel, where he's focusing on the larger issue of the mating crisis, gender war stuff that's taking place between black men and women, well, white men and women as well, but our focus is on the black community. Now, this relates to my previous video on them NFL draft boys and why some of them were dating interracially. It relates to that because these desirability rankings are also an example of intersexual competition between same-sex rivals. So I'm going to explain why this sexual racial hierarchy exists and why there is a sex-specific asymmetry in interracial dating between black men and women, meaning, why are black men, rated more highly in these desirability rankings by racial group than black women are. Now, because it's really complex question what we're discussing here, this will be the first of 3 videos addressing this question, as there's just too much ground to cover this in 15 minutes or whatever. This is going to need to be 10, 15 minutes for each video. Now let's get right into what Jeff St. James said. Now, he asked, what causes black women to be at the bottom of the totem pole of desirability? Now, at its core, this is primarily a question of sexual selection, which is the process of how sexual romantic preferences that we have shape how men and women select some people as mates, and then they'll reject others. So this is a merciless process, this sexual selection process. Basically, it boils down to be preferred as a mate by the opposite sex, one must have the qualities people desire in a mate. And that applies equally to men and women. No one's safe there. Either you got it or you don't. Now, I'm going to start by describing the outcomes of a study analyzing status differences by race. Now, this study is important because status is one of the traits that humans use when choosing their mates. So if there are status differences by race, then it will play a role in the perception of racial differences in attractiveness. And the title of this study, so you can check it out for yourself, you can go to Google Scholar and type in, the space between us and them, perceptions of status differences. And this is from 2009. And it was a collaboration between Harvard University and UCLA that was performed about 16 years ago, and it explored racial status differences using several hundred of students from both of these universities as participants. And it reported that in the United States, across white, Latino, Asian Americans, and African Americans, there was strong agreement amongst all of these groups that white people occupy the top social position in the United States, followed by Asians, followed by Latinos, with African Americans at the bottom of American society. Now, this racially diverse group of hundreds show that everyone is aware of the racial hierarchy and who's in what position in that hierarchy. And there obviously are status differences based on that. Now, a related study I want to discuss is called Looming Large in Others' Eyes. Racial stereotypes illuminate dual adaptations for representing threat versus prestige as physical size. Now, this was a study performed by an evolutionary psychologist named Colin Holbrook and some of his colleagues in 2016. And this study documented that basically black skin is a cue of lower status in the minds of many people. In fact, speaking on his own research, this psychologist, Colin Holbrook, he said, and I'm quoting now, I've never been so disgusted by my own research. Now, he was disgusted by the conclusions from this study where he used 1,500 participants, and it was based on what people assumed about other people based on just seeing their name and not the actual person. So Holbrook found that a character with a black sounding name was assumed to be physically larger, more prone to aggression, and lower in status than a character with a white sounding name. The participants didn't even need to see a black man. The negative link is so strong in the minds of some people, just a black sounding name, like Deshaun, it can invoke anti-black psychology and, the feelings of threat. Now, one of the other psychologists on the study, he said, in essence, the brain's representational system has a toggle switch, such that size can be used to represent either threat or status, meaning that for white men, a big white man, he can represent threat, but it can also represent something positive like having high social dominance and status. However, apparently, because stereotypes of black men as dangerous are deeply entrenched, it's very difficult for the participants in this study to flip the switch when thinking about black men. So, for study participants evaluating black protagonists, dangerous equals big, and big equals dangerous, period. Now, there are many other studies similar to those that support black people are perceived as having a lower status based on our race alone. Now, beliefs like that will restrict and keep black people lower in the mate desirability rankings because status plays a strong role in how we choose our mates. So that's one of the ways that anti-black psychology, these negative stereotypes embedded in culture, can then harm our status, and then status is involved in mate choice, so it lowers black people down in any kind of desirability rankings like what Mr. St. James was talking about. Now, you may be saying to yourself, if that's true, so if black women are at the bottom because of anti-blackness and white supremacist cultural beliefs about black people, shouldn't black men be at the bottom of these, desirability rankings as well? Well, there are a few mitigating factors that, even though anti-blackness is on black men and it pushes them down and makes people see us as a threat and aggressive and stuff, there's some things that pushes up. Now, one of these issues is that black people are perceived as being more masculine compared to other races. And take note of my wording there. I didn't say black men are seen as more masculine, I said black people. So I'm also talking about black boys, black girls, and black women. They are also perceived as being more masculinized than the other races. So, and the blacker we look, the more black African we look, the more masculine blacks are perceived to be. So the more aggressive we're perceived to be, the bigger we're perceived to be, the more African we look. Now, in several different contexts, this masculinized view of black people, it harms us, whether one is male or female. It harms black men, for example, let's say, in the labor market. If you're perceiving black men as large and aggressive, you're going to be less likely to want to hire that guy. And of course, we all know in our interactions with cops, they are quick to put hands on a black man because of that feeling of threat. And there's some other things going on there as well, but that's good enough right there. They're feeling more threatened, that we're more aggressive, so they're going to be more likely for excessive use of force on black men and black women too. It harms black kids because it causes other races to perceive them as older than they really are, which leads to them being more harshly disciplined because they're expecting more mature behavior out of them. So if you perceive, let's say, a black kid who's really 9, but you're perceiving them as 12 or 13, well, you're going to expect more mature behavior. And when you don't see it, then you know in schools they're going to be disciplined for poor behavior because they're expecting more mature behavior out of them. Now, it harms black women in several contexts, and one of them is going to be in interracial dating. Now, the gender differences in our evolved sexual psychology play a role in why black men are not at the bottom of the sexual rankings as black women are. Black men have some desired traits associated with strong physical masculinity, just like we just heard in those studies. So they're seen as larger and more physically aggressive. But strong physical masculinity goes along with having let's say good musculature, height, and a deep voice. So those right there, in terms of body attractiveness, they are very strong attractive traits that we see women find very attractive in men cross-culturally. Now, in the study I discussed earlier from Colin Holbrook about the black sounding names, it caused perceptions of large, aggressive, black men. So being physically large and behaviorally aggressive are both qualities associated with strong masculinity. So in other words, they're telling you they perceive black men as having more strong physical masculinity. Now, to those reports from Colin Holbrook's study, we can add another study done in 2010, and I'm going to give you the name of that as well so you can read this for yourself. Now, this was titled Self-Protective Biases in Group Categorization. Threat cues shape the psychological boundary between us and them. Now, the participants in this experiment were asked to categorize voice recordings with a low or high degree of masculinity. So we're talking about, that deep bass in your voice for that strong, masculine sound. Now, they found that white participants of this experiment were more likely to categorize the more masculine voices as black male voices. So for all those 3 traits now, they're just white people are perceiving black people, black men, as being more strongly physically masculine than other men. Now, and as I said, it causes a lot of problems, but when it comes to the mating market now, it can enhance a black male's attractiveness. But what those and other studies are empirical evidence of is that black men are perceived as being more masculine than other men, and in many social contexts, strong masculinity will be perceived as threatening. But in the mating market, a lot of women find strong masculinity attractive. Now, not all women find strong masculinity attractive, but for the ones that do, they may find black men quite attractive. So this can be the mitigating factor that lifts black men off the bottom of the desirability rankings. So blacks being perceived as more masculine operates in a totally opposite fashion for black women. Black females being perceived as more masculine compared to white, Latino, and Asian women places them at a sexual selective disadvantage in the interracial mating game because men are, attracted to femininity in women. They are also, they stereotype black women as loud and aggressive and angry compared to other women. And all of those behaviors, being aggressive and, angry and stuff, these are behaviors more strongly associated with men and masculinity. So, given that data regarding what is negatively associated with being black and being more masculine, it's pretty clear how and why both place black women at a sexual selective disadvantage in competition with white and Asian women for desirable men. And it locates them at the bottom of that global desirability rankings that Jeff St. James was talking about. Now, this applies in reverse to East Asians. Just as blacks are perceived as more masculinized, East Asians are perceived as more feminized. So this reverses it for them. So now this makes Asian American women perceived as more feminine. That's going to enhance them in the mating market. But then Asian American men being perceived as, less masculine compared to other men, that's going to harm them in the mating market. And they are, quite emasculated when they're portrayed in television and media. Certainly that has been the history. Maybe that's changing a bit now, which is good for them. But yeah, there is a history of portraying Asian American men in a quite, emasculated, feminized manner. So there's a lot more to discuss on this topic. So there'll be 2 more videos to discuss this. We're going to discuss culture a lot and some of the psychologies that we have to discuss. So, but I'm going to stop that one here. Any questions you got, place them in the comments. And if you want me to analyze something else from an evolutionary psychological perspective, put that request in the comment section and you'll see it analyzed in a future video.